anyone working on it at all. The editor was fired, all of the publicity team were fired. It was just kind of like released into a void where nobody knew anything about it. I don't think I even had an email address of anyone I could contact at the publisher anymore.
Welcome to Queries, Qualms, and Quirks, the weekly podcast that asks published authors to share their successful query letter and discuss their journey from first spark to date of publication. I am your host, author Sarah Nicolas, and literary agent Sarah N. Fisk. Lauren James is the twice Carnegie-nominated British author of many young adult novels, including Green Rising, The Reckless Afterlife of Harriet Stoker, and The Loneliest Girl in the Universe. She is an RLF Royal Fellow, freelance editor, and screenwriter. Lauren is the founder of the Climate Fiction Writers League and on the board of the Authors and Illustrators Sustainability Working Group through the Society of Authors. So please welcome Lauren to the show. Hello.
Hello, I'm so excited to be here today.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're here. So we're going to talk about your writing journey, and we're going to start by going back all the way to the beginning. When did you first start getting interested in writing? And then how long did it take before you started getting serious about pursuing publication?
So I'm one of those people who started really young. So I was always a big reader. I would used to go to the library and I would get as many books out as I could with my library card, my mum's, my dad's and my brother's. And I would read everything and then go back the next week for more. So by the time I was like 14 or 15, I'd read literally everything in my local library and I wanted to read stuff that didn't exist. So I started writing my own. And when I was 16, I started writing a story about a boy and a girl who kept being reborn and coming back to life over history and meeting each other. And one of the big drivers for me to start writing rather than just reading a lot was that my friends were doing Nanowrimo, which I'm sure your listeners know all about, but if they don't, National Novel Writing, where you try and write a whole novel in 1 month. And the appeal for me was that there was the website where you can like upload the cover and put in a little description and it feels like a real book and you get to see your friends do the same and like update their word count every day. So I took this like idea I'd had about this couple being brought back to life throughout history and I started trying to write it in Nanowrimo, and I picked it up a few years in a row when I was like 17 and 18. At the same time I was studying at university, completely different to anything related to writing. I did chemistry and physics. So writing for me was like really a hobby, like pure fun, because when you do something like physics, there's no essay writing even, it's all like algebra. So really like the only time I opened a Word document was to write my story. It was brilliant. Which meant I got through every summer holiday or Christmas holiday. I would just write and write and write. And by the end of my third year, so when I was about 19, I finished the first draft of this novel. So it was literally the first thing I ever wrote. And then I was just planning to like put it away until I graduated, because I'd read that Stephen King said you should always write your drafts and then put them in a drawer and then come back to them in a few years. So I was like, okay, I've got to do my degree anyway, so I'll do that. About a month after that, there was a lot of excitement on social media because Harper Voyager, the science fiction imprint, announced that they were going to do open submissions where anyone could submit a manuscript without an agent. And so I pulled my manuscript out because it was kind of like time travel-y, sci-fi-y, and sent it off to them, like read it and did a few like minor edits and sent it off. I didn't really know anything about publishing, so it was very long. It was like 120,000 words when it should have been 70,000 words. And it had like plot lines that didn't really go anywhere, but I thought that the characters were really strong and they had some nice romantic beats. So I thought that there would be something there that they might be interested in. That didn't go anywhere, but that process of me, like tidying it up for Harper Voyager and looking over it kind of kickstarted me into going, I think this is good enough to do something with. So this is 2012 when there was a big YA boom happening where there were like the big John Green books and Rainbow Rowell books were getting really popular. So agents were actively buying up lots of young adult fiction, especially in the UK, where most of the big YA books were American. So they wanted books that were written by UK authors for the UK market.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the moment that you realized that you wanted to be a published author and what you thought that might look like for you?
I don't really know that I ever believed it was going to happen. I think like it was kind of just this thing I was doing on the side while I was at uni for something completely different. And I was always intending to graduate and go on to do a PhD. And it was kind of like I didn't know anyone who'd sold a book or anything like that. I couldn't even name any authors who were like young that were my age. So at the time I was like 21. So it wasn't really that I thought it was going to happen, but it was just kind of interesting to me to like explore this stuff and see what someone thought of my writing. And I thought that even if it didn't go anywhere, it would be really valuable to get some feedback on what they liked about my writing and what I should be focusing on. So the whole time I was like, I'm not going to get my hopes up. I'm not going to believe this is going to happen. It's just something that I'm going to do out of interest. And then when I did get a book deal, it was still kind of like I thought it was going to be taken away for a really long time, or mine. So probably I didn't realize that I could actually be an author and that it was something that was achievable until like I got the proof copy. Because before that, I was constantly telling myself I shouldn't get my hopes up about anything. And then when you have the book in your hands, it's hard to do that, and you can kind of be like, okay, I'll probably start telling people about this now. So yeah, it definitely wasn't ever something that I thought I'm going to be an author and I'm going to make this my career goal. My goal was always to do science, and then I like managed to stumble into writing alongside that.
Then how did you learn more about the publishing industry, specifically like how to query, how to find agents, that kind of thing?
A big thing for me was Twitter. When I got my agent, I obviously went and looked up her Twitter, and from there I was like following all the people she was following in and learning a lot about the UK publishing industry. So there's a really big, amazing community on Twitter. A part of that is through the UKYA chat, which used to be a great like hashtag chat that would happen every weekend, and everyone would like tweet and answer these questions. And so you immediately knew who to follow because you could see who was engaged in this chat. And so very early on at the very beginning, I think probably before I even got a book deal, I was like following a lot of these people and making friends with all the publicists and the book reviewers and stuff, and kind of getting involved in that and just like listening in on their conversations and seeing what they were talking about, and kind of having to go away and Google things when they mentioned them and I didn't know what they were talking about. And that's kind of something I've been doing ever since, like, so for like a decade now, is just like learning from the conversations going on Twitter and paying attention to what people think is important and trying to kind of take advice, whether it's given to me in person or just as a general thing going out into the world.
Nice. A lot of people have mentioned Twitter, especially around that time.
I did know about the Writers and Artists Yearbook as well, which was a big guide to getting published in the UK with lots of essays by editors and agents. But I was a very poor student at the time, and I think it's about £25, and that was just out of my reach, especially because in my head I was still telling myself that like this is just something I'm doing for fun, this isn't going to be a job, it's not going to happen. So the idea of spending money on a book was like just felt very silly to me. So I probably would have learned a lot more and been less confused if I'd gone and bought that, but yeah, I wasn't at a place where I could do that.
So then what happened? Can you break down for us your querying journey all the way up to signing your first book contract?
Yes. So like I said, this was around the time there was a big boom happening in young adult fiction. So agents were actively looking for manuscripts. So I ended up sending my manuscript that was very long out to about 6 agents. And within a month or two, Claire Wilson at Rogers, Coleridge and Wright replied saying she'd like to read it. So I sent her the full manuscript and she replied and she did a revise and resubmit. So she basically said, I really like this. It's really funny, which was a big thing that I used to carry around. Like, she thinks I'm funny. And you've got a really strong like romance and the characters are really well built. But it's got some, so because it's set in multiple different storylines, there's like 3 alternating threads. And one of them was a dystopia, which she said wasn't selling very well at the time. So she wanted me to revise that so it wasn't a dystopia and just tighten the whole thing up and cut the word count down. So I was like, I'm still at uni. I've got to wait until my next summer holidays before I can do these edits, or Easter holidays, whatever it was. So it took me 6 months to get to the edits and send a revised manuscript over to her. And then she read it and offered to represent me. And so then we sent out the manuscript to, I think, 10 UK editors in December 2013, and within 2 weeks we had 2 offers, which was obviously very exciting. I was very stressed out, and I had no idea of how long submissions usually take. So I was like really nervous about it. And later I found out that like it can take many months to get replies. So I felt a bit like I was complaining for no reason about how stressed I found the whole thing. But it was very lovely having two offers come in, and that they were bidding against each other. So I did phone calls with the 2 editors, and they had completely different ideas about how they wanted to take the manuscript. So one of them really wanted to lean into the historical element and expand that storyline and keep that as complete within the story as equal to like the contemporary storyline. And then the other editor wanted to like cut that back and mainly have it be a contemporary story with a few like flashbacks from their previous lives. And I really like the historical stuff because the big draw for me was like I was a huge fan of like Jane Austen and stuff, and I wanted to do all those kind of like Regency romance tropes in there. So it was very easy for me to see on the phone immediately which editor I would work with better. And very luckily that publisher offered more anyway, so it wasn't a decision I had to make about a creative point of view, but it matched up with the alignment I had of how I felt I could work with that editor. And I've had that same editor ever since. So coming on a decade now, she's edited all my books. We've got to the point where our relationship is really solid and quite casual. So she said that she'll publish whatever I want to write. So it's not stressful at all. I just kind of pitch ideas and send in proposals, and we just like work together. It's not a process that I get anxious about. It's just like a long-term relationship that with my publisher that is going to keep continuing on to the future. And I'm editing an anthology with her, so I'm kind of like doing a lot of editing work with them as well. They've hired me in as a freelance editor to work on some science projects. So yeah, I have a really strong relationship with basically the first person I ever spoke to in the publishing industry, which has been amazing. I definitely think my experience would have been completely different if I'd been moving around editors or if they'd been going to different.
Yeah, it's funny because that feels like a very kind of like old school, like that's the way they did it, like in the early 1900s in American publishing, you know?
Yeah, I've got a really lovely publisher. It's an independent publisher called Walker Books, and they just publish children's books. And all of the editors there have been there for their whole career. They don't leave if they will get a job there. So I think it does lean into that kind of, like you say, old school publishing style that goes back a long way.
Cool. All right, it is time for the first cue of the podcast. Can you read your successful query letter for us?
This is for the story I've been talking about the couple that keep being brought back to life. So when it got published, it ended up being called The Next Together. But in the query letter, I used the title The Red Earth Rolls, which obviously got changed pretty early on. I don't think it's a very good title. Now I know anything at all about publishing. So, dear agent, The Red Earth Rolls is a completed 120,000-word young adult novel based on the idea of reincarnation. It encompasses genres such as dystopia, Regency, romance, science fiction, and thriller. An adventure spanning 300 years, this story has something to interest every reader. Catherine and Matthew have done this before. They keep being brought back to life, and every time they do, things seem to be getting worse. In 1745, Catherine Horwood is spending a little too much time with her coachman, Matthew, when the Jacobites attack the city of Carlisle on the border of Scotland and England. Somehow the city has to defend itself against the feared Highlanders, and Catherine is determined to help in any way she can, regardless of the consequences. In 1853, Katie, an orphan girl, is running from the police in disguise when she accidentally gets stuck on board a steamer bound for the battlefield of the Crimean War. Luckily, a journalist is there to take her under his wing, although there is the slight problem in that he thinks she's a boy. Together they try and help the war effort as much as possible, despite the hostility of the soldiers. In 2090, Kate meets a new researcher in her biology lab and discovers that together they bear a startling resemblance to her mysterious great-aunt and uncle. Meanwhile, Kate keeps recalling memories that aren't hers. The siege of a castle, a kiss that never happened on a battlefield from a history book. In every lifetime, they are fighting for what is right, but however hard they try to help, will it ever be enough to stop them being brought back once more? Revealing the power of love regardless of circumstance, this book looks at the determination of two people in the face of growing turmoil. It should appeal to students, people who grew up speaking the language of the internet, who enjoy science fiction but also have a soft spot for Jane Austen. The Red Earth Rolls was written by a teenager for teenagers. I'm currently in the third year of a chemistry and physics degree at the University of Nottingham. I wrote this novel after becoming increasingly frustrated by the glamorized science often found in media. This prompted me to write a more accurate story about scientists, and my love of history and genealogy brought forth another element. I would greatly appreciate any advice you could offer me about my manuscript. Thank you very much for your time and consideration.
Awesome. Thank you. It would be awesome if every query letter was read in a British accent. I would love that.
Did that make it a bit nicer to listen to? Such a long chunk of speaking.
I love it. So how has your experience been since signing your contract? You talked a little bit about it before, but especially were there any surprises along the way? Was there anything about the process that really surprised you?
The main struggles I've had have been kind of how different territories work in terms of like before you get published, you don't really think about books as these things that exist like in the UK and in America and in Australia, because online they're just books and you'll hear someone talking about a book that is really popular on social media and you won't really think about where it's published or who by. But a lot of the stuff that is so important to publishers and also to authors is whether this is something that is going to sell to foreign publishers. And especially in the UK, is this something that is going to be commercial in America? And can we sell this to an American publisher and get kind of a simultaneous edit and release? And so that's something that, like, as an UK author, it had to really change your perspective on like the kind of books you write. And it's something I think about a lot in terms of like, I want to write books that represent the regional hometown I come from and like have the kind of British accents and stuff that we have here. But is that something that is going to be commercial internationally? And do you want to have like a long-term career where you can publish books around the world? Or do you want to write books that represent the place where you were born and show the culture of the place you live? And obviously, like, particularly for the UK, there's a lot of love in America of UK culture and, like you said, the accents. And so I have a very like minor example of that, but that's something that, especially since I got my book deal, you see a lot of talk about kind of how can we make books more diverse and show people's different lives and experiences. And that's come to be seen as a thing that is like embraced and it's something that publishers look for, whereas definitely it was something that was kind of discussed as this thing like, can we Americanize this and cut out a lot of those things that make this book British so that it is more marketable to our audience? And I don't think that's something you see as much now. It feels like it's more like, this is a book that's set somewhere else and it embraces all these differences. So yeah, that was a big surprise. I guess as well in terms of like how much of writing is a commercial decision rather than a passion project decision. So I've written 10 novels now, and my process has changed so much from just writing what I want to read to kind of finding an idea that I love, but also that I think is going to sell, and that my editor and my agent and my producer, they all think is going to sell. And when they have suggestions, like taking them on board, and even if they don't match up with my original vision, knowing that like it's going to be more valuable in the long term to find a way to fit into all our goals, so that you can justify spending time on a story you love. So all those kind of things, where you have to kind of adapt something that you do as a hobby into something that is a job, were probably the big things for me.
It is time for the quick round. I call it author DNA. It's just classifications that we like to put writers in sometimes. First question, are you a pantser or a plotter?
Hugely a plotter.
Do you tend to be an overwriter or an underwriter?
Underwriter.
Do you like to write in the morning or at night more?
I'm a massive night owl. Yeah.
When starting with a new project, do you typically start with a character or plot or concept or something else first?
The romance, usually, like how I can make two characters who play off each other.
Do you prefer coffee or tea?
Tea. Earl Grey.
When you're writing, do you prefer silence or some kind of sound?
Music. Lots and lots of playlists for every project.
When it comes to the first draft, are you more of a get it down kind of person or a get it right kind of person?
Probably I'd like to say get it right, but usually I immediately finish it and find out that I got it wrong anyway.
What tools or software do you use to draft?
Microsoft Word, Workflowy, Final Draft, Excel, and Canva.
Wow. All right. Do you prefer drafting or revising more?
Drafting, particularly like the development stage when you're trying to work out details like what's the inciting incident, what's the conflict, what's going to be like the lowest point, what are the stakes going to be, how can I find a romance where these two people fit together, and how can you show that they make each other better people, what are the themes, and then like having to actually put all those things down on the page is the harder part, but kind of planning it all out and coming up with a long outline is my favorite.
Do you write in sequential order or do you hop around?
Sequential order.
And final quick round question, are you an extrovert or an introvert?
It's so hard. Probably an introvert, but I think you have to be an extrovert for events. So I kind of like trick myself into feeling like I'm an extrovert when I do stuff like record podcasts.
The show is called Queries, Qualms, and Quirks, and we already talked about your query. Now we're going to talk about the second Q. What were some of the worries that you had on your journey, and were they realized, or how did you overcome them?
So the big thing has always been money, because famously writing doesn't pay very much. So when I got a book deal, I was about to graduate. I was like 4 months away from graduating. So I decided that I was going to take a gap year where I was going to see if I could write full time for a year, living with my parents. And then if it didn't work out, I would go and get a real job. I have been on that gap year ever since. It's kind of worked out well for me. I've managed to write alongside the freelance work like editing and teaching. And in the UK, we also have the Arts Council, which is an amazing organisation funded by the National Lottery who support anyone doing creative practices. So if you have a book deal or have interest in a project and you also can prove that you're doing events that reach certain demographics and you have data on who your events reach, then you can apply for a grant to support and give you time to write. They also did amazing coronavirus support as well during the pandemic, which helped a lot with money troubles. We also have some amazing funds, like the Society of Authors offers a lot of support for their writers as well. And the Royal Literary Fund is another one. So yeah, the money's always been a big worry for me. And it's like nearly every year I'm like, okay, this is going to be the last year I can write full time. I'm going to have to go and get a teaching job or something along the side. And I would try to like think of like things that I could do that were connected to writing alongside that. But I've managed to stay self-employed and freelance the whole time. And I've written a book every year and kept publishing a book each year. So it's worked out. I think the longer it goes on, the easier it gets because you build a name and a reputation. So I'm not doing as much hustling. I used to spend so much time kind of sending out cold emails and trying to like get bookings to go and talk in schools or to do a guest lecture at a university, or kind of promoting my work as a freelance editor and stuff on social media. And now those requests come to me and I get more than I have time for, so I can kind of pick and choose what I'm most interested in. And it's not that like I've changed what I'm offering, it's just that people know my name. So it's got a lot easier to feel like this is a career that I can do long term and I'm not going to have to go and get a real job. Obviously, having a degree and a backup job that I could go and do makes that a lot less scary. And I've had a lot of family support in that I could stay with and live with my parents until I was ready to like stand on my own and earn enough money, which did take a few years. But I'm really glad that I stuck through and did it, because the creative side of writing is what I wanted out of science, because people obviously usually think it's really surprising that I went from doing physics to writing because they're so different. But for me, what I liked about science was the idea of like exploring and discovering and doing something different each day. But then actually when you do work in a science lab, it's just kind of you're doing the same experiment every day for 4 months and varying like minor things. So it's not too much exploring and discovering. It's very repetitive. But the bit of my brain that lit up from like learning and curiosity and stuff, I get that now from like research and writing and imagining worlds in stories. So that's was a big worry for me was the money and the whether I should be going back to science, because that was what I was more interested in, and kind of sticking with it is something I'm really happy I did.
And now it's time for the third Q. Do you have any writing quirks? Is there anything about your writing process that you think is kind of different or interesting or unique?
The big thing that I do is outlines. So I write huge outlines, like 10 pages, thousands of words long. And from all the writers that I've ever taught or spoken to or edited, they're always horrified when I suggest that, and they hate writing outlines, but it's my favorite part. Like I said, I love the development stage, and I see an outline as like the tool that you absolutely need to write well, because I think you need to be able to see the project as a whole, so you know what you're doing, so you can know how to start it. Until you know the end, how do you know what you need to set up in the initial scenes? It's like a blueprint or a map where you can move things around, and you don't have to go into your bulky draft and edit things when you have an idea. You can just go into the outline and run through a change all the way through and see if it fits in the plot threads. And it just like is, for me, it's how I discuss the idea with clarity and distill what I want to do down to the core things I want to achieve, and establish the tone of how I can set up running jokes or have characters that will do certain things in the plot, and have, rather than having like characters who appear for one scene and then disappear, you can see like how can I weave them in so they have time on the page to become three-dimensional. Like all those kinds of things I do in the outline stage, and everyone I ever edit hates it when I ask for a long outline like that. And usually they end up being really proud of what they've put into it and finding it really useful. But yeah, they don't like it along the way, especially if they're like a pantser who just wants to write and see where they're going to go.
When you were in the lowest parts of your writing journey, whatever that may have been, what kept you going and why did you stick to it?
So a big thing that I found really difficult is for my first book, my American publisher closed down twice. So when I first got a UK deal, they sold it to an American publisher. That American publisher very quickly closed down, so they had to resell it. Luckily, they did manage to resell it. And the first book and the second book in the duology were published. But a month before the second book was published, that imprint closed down. So it didn't have anyone working on it at all. The editor was fired. All of the publicity team were fired. It was just kind of like released into a void where nobody knew anything about it. I don't think I even had an email address of anyone I could contact at the publisher anymore, because anyone I'd ever spoken to was just fired. So that was really stressful. And that felt like really panicky, in that it's so hard for UK authors to break into the American market at all. And I felt so lucky to have got an American deal with anyone, and then to feel like I kind of lost my chance was really difficult. What I always try to do is have lots of things that I'm working on at the same time, so that if something like that happens with one book, it's not the end of the world. It's not like my one baby and child that I need to that I've got all my hopes pinned on. It's like one of many, and I can just focus on the next thing, and whatever happens with that is beyond my control. Because I think the biggest thing I've learned over 10 years is that what is successful does not necessarily match up with what you as a writer are most proud of, because so much of success comes down to luck. So the books that I personally think I did the best writing craft work with, and that I think I pushed myself the most on, they don't necessarily match up with the sales figures, because either the marketing was off, or it didn't hit the publishing industry release at the right time for what was big at that moment, or it didn't get picked up by this one Instagrammer who managed to get it out to a certain audience. Like all of that stuff you can't control. You just have to keep focusing on writing the next thing. And if you, as an author, are lucky enough to be allowed to publish something else, then that is the only thing that matters to me, is knowing that I can keep going and keep feeling like I am being allowed to write things that feel fresh and new to me and stretch me and challenge me. I've had cases where publishers have been like, we really like this book that you did. Can you not write this thing you've submitted, but instead write something very similar to that book that was really successful? And that is something I absolutely don't want to do. I want to always be kind of writing things that I feel like I can learn from, and they're developing new skills for me. Like, I'd love to do a book with an unreliable narrator, or something that has a reverse chronology, or something where the main character has amnesia, like things where I can do something different with the form. That's the joy in it for me that keeps me going, when it's like, this bit didn't work, but I learned something new that I can apply to the next thing, and the next thing will be better. Another big thing that was really hard was during the pandemic, I had 3 books come out, which is an insane number to come out at a time when most of the UK bookshops are closed. So I do feel like some of the books that came out then lost their chance, because I do a lot of events and go and visit schools and festivals and stuff, and there was obviously none of that. So it felt like it was a really quiet release for those books, and it just still feel a bit like they haven't come out yet because I haven't had a chance to talk about them and do like the tour with them. So that's been really tough. But I think that once you've got a backlist in place, you're always going to have readers go, if they like your stuff, they'll go away and read your old titles. So they're never going to be lost as long as they're still in print, because they're going to get out there at some point.
Yeah. Do you feel like you made any mistakes along the way that you would like to warn listeners about, so maybe they don't make the same ones?
I wouldn't ever consider anything that I do that's connected to writing a mistake, because even if the thing itself fails, I make connections with people through it, and it leads to other opportunities that I wouldn't have considered. So I always try to do new things. Like I said, I don't like to get bored. I like to be constantly experimenting. So I've done stuff like start a podcast that didn't work. I've done serialized novels online where I post chapter by chapter. I set up a writing group of climate authors. I used to do a lot of book reviewing, like all those kind of things were just, had things that I wanted to learn about. So I would experiment, and if they didn't work, I feel like they led to a lot of opportunities further down the line. At the start, like I said, I was really worried about money. So I did a lot of teaching, and that takes up a lot of time, especially if you're kind of preparing a whole module of lectures and then teaching them. Like, the pay can never match up with how much time you have to invest in developing a lecture series like that. And I could have easily written a whole of a novel in that time, but it was something that I don't look back on as a mistake, even if it felt like it was taking up too much of my time when I was doing it, because through that I made so many like local industry connections, and I was able to talk in a way about my writing process and craft in terms that helped condense what I was working on to myself. It was a lot more instinctive before, whereas once I'd taught it to other people, I kind of had terms to describe what I was doing that allowed me to focus on my weak areas and find ways to develop them. So yeah, all those kinds of things that are like business areas of like, how can I explore how to publicize work, or do some marketing work, or do something connected with editing. They don't often work out, but they teach me things to take on to the next thing, and skills. A big thing that I wish I'd done, actually, that I just thought of, I probably should still do, is do a course right at the beginning in graphic design, because I've never had any graphic design training, and you have to make so many like little things like headers for your website, or events like graphics, or a bookmark design and stuff. And I used to suffer through trying to do all those kind of things with no training. And then I discovered Canva, which obviously is a very easy, free, online within your browser graphic design thing with templates. And even then, like, I struggled through it and hated every moment of the process of trying to teach myself how to use Canva, which is very easy to use. It's designed to be user friendly, and I still hated it. So I probably should have taken some kind of Photoshop or graphic design course back in 2012, and that would have been the most useful thing that would have cut out a lot of suffering time for me.
Can you share with listeners one of the most important lessons that you learned on your journey to publication?
I think to always trust your own instincts and remember that it's your book, and at the end of the day, nobody else cares about it as much as you do, and that editors' advice is often really valuable, but it's not valuable in terms of you should do the thing they suggest. It's valuable in terms of pointing out where the errors are, and you can find your own ways to solve those errors as long as you do address them. And you shouldn't make changes that you're not happy with, because you will always regret that, and you won't regret pulling out of a deal or telling them that you have a problem with this and talking it through and finding a different solution in the long term, because you will make something that you're proud of. And the most joyful part of this career is that I'm constantly making things that I want to make, and I'm only doing things that I'm interested in, and I don't have an employer telling me what to do. I'm just creating things that I want to exist in the world. And if you ever compromise that, then for me that reduces the whole point of doing this very difficult job, because you're not doing the one thing you wanted to do from the beginning. So yeah, that's probably the most important thing.
All right, I call this the acknowledgements portion of the podcast. This is not a business that most of us succeed in completely on our own. So who are some of the people or even organizations who helped you along the way and how?
So obviously the biggest one, I'm sure everyone says this, but my agent, Claire, she's been there since day one, and she picked me out of the slush pile, and she has answered every single panicky email I've ever sent and been really kind and taken the time to teach me. My editor, who I've worked with since the beginning as well, when I look back at some of the structural edit letters that she sent, they're so different to the ones she's sending me now. She took the time to invest in me long term and help teach me why she was asking for these changes in a way that's paid off dividends in our relationship going forward. But that she didn't have to do. She could have just told me what to do without taking that time to kind of invest in helping me develop my editing style. Also, like I said, the UK blogging community, where I basically learned everything from Twitter, particularly from people like Lucy Powery, who set up the UKYA chat, Jim, Charlie in a Book, all of those kind of people who have been there since the very early days when YA wasn't this big trendy genre that it is now. They were just there for the love of children's fiction, and this kind of industry has boomed around them, and they're so nice and supportive to debut authors. And then a lot of local writing organisations like Writing West Midlands here in the UK, who took me on as a tutor and let me teach some classes. The University of Coventry in my local city, where they let me come in and teach, and hired me to do little writing things with the City of Culture, all of those kinds of local organisations where, looking back, you're like, why did they ever let me do that? I had no evidence that I could do that well. They just wanted to help a local author, and giving me a reference like that was allowed me to go on to other stuff. It was really invaluable. And I feel really lucky that I got those opportunities early on. So some of those people.
Nice. All right, Lauren, before you go, can you tell us about your latest release?
Yes, so Green Rising was my latest novel. It is a climate change thriller. So I've been wanting to write about climate change for a long time based on my science background. But I wanted to find a way in that felt really positive and uplifting rather than kind of a depressing dystopia. And I ended up coming up with this idea where teenagers have magic that allows them to grow plants from their hands. And these green fingers use this plant magic to rewild the planet and kind of pull a heist on all of the organisations and companies who are allowing climate change to continue for their own benefit, whether that is to sell oil or to get to Mars and establish a colony there. They kind of do this heist and thriller on them. And it's very political. It's very funny, I hope. It's also got a bit of a romance. And if you're at all worried about climate change, hopefully you will leave this book feeling really inspired and excited and with an idea in mind of exactly what we need to do next to fix the planet, whether we have plant magic or not.
Nice. Thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your story with everyone.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Queries, Qualms, and Quirks. You can find the text of Lauren's query in the show notes, along with links to find out more about her and her books. If you enjoyed the show, I'd really appreciate if you'd help me find new listeners by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser, telling your friends, or sharing this episode on social media. If you're interested in supporting the show, go to patreon.com/pubtalklive. And if you're a published author interested in being a guest on the show, please click on the home base link in the description or go to sarahnicolas.com and click on the podcast logo in the sidebar. That's Sarah with an H and Nicolas with no H. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.